Здравствуйте, вы смотрите «Русский час». Сегодня у нас своего рода мобильный телемост между Москвой и городком Колчестер в Англии. Именно там мы встречаемся со старым другом «Русского часа», известным британским православным священником и главным редактором портала «Православная Англия» Orthodox England, отцом Эндрю Филлипсом. В 2015 году отец Эндрю написал для нашей книги «ДНК России. Russia's DNA» эссе под названием «Новая холодная война. Взгляд из Народной Англии». Даже меньше чем через 10 лет его предсказания сбылись. Кто виноват и что делать, сегодня мы поговорим с отцом Эндрю.
Hello, dear Father Andrew. It's been a decade since you wrote an essay for our book, Russia's DNA. And in that essay, you wrote what a tragedy it would be if, because of today's intriguers, Anglophobia and Russophobia were once more to grow and so revive the long-dead Cold War, creating a new Cold War. That would be a betrayal both of fair play and of the British and Russian peoples who only want and need peace. Now, a decade later, we find ourselves in a semi-hot war between Russia and Britain, with the Ukrainian army firing British missiles on Russian targets. Who were those intriguers, and what are the primary reasons behind the escalation of the crisis that began in 2014 and transformed into a Russian-Ukrainian and global tragedy, and into the collapse of Russo-British relations?
I think we should take a historical prospect. Links between Britain and Russia began in the 16th century under the Tudors, but these were a number of London merchants travelling to the White Sea in particular for trade, and then trade directly with what we call Muscovy. And of course, Muscovy is a purely Russian word. It's Moskvy. It's the English form, in other words, Moscow. And relations continued on a very low level. Traders in certain commodities in the 17th, 18th centuries. And then really what happened was the Napoleonic Wars. Now, England and Russia were on the same side, fighting Napoleon. And as we know, Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, he reached Moscow, then the retreat from Moscow. And in 1814, what happened? Paris was liberated by Russian troops. And what happened then was that suddenly there was a consciousness. Paris is, after all, not so far away from London. And there were Russian troops liberating it. If I may quote one anecdote, there is a French word which is bistro. A bistro is a cafe, and it's actually the Russian word bystre, because the Russian troops, they wanted fast food. They wanted to eat, so they'd shout, bystre, bystre, fast, fast, in order to get their food. And this word bystre entered into the French language as bistro, as a cafe. So there were really quite close connections. And of course, the aristocracy of Russia all spoke French at the time, sometimes better than they spoke Russian. And suddenly there was this consciousness in England, well, the Russians are here, they're next door. And they realized that they hadn't defeated Napoleon alone, they defeated Napoleon together with others, including Russia. Russia became the great power. And slowly, this mentality turned in the 1830s into Russophobia. People began to dislike Russia, to publish propaganda against Russia. The Russians are evil, they want to destroy us, they are our enemies. And lo and behold, in 1853, there began the Crimean War. England was allied with Napoleon III, the next Napoleon, Napoleon's nephew, who'd made himself president and then became an emperor, made himself emperor of France. So 40 years after Napoleon, Britain was allied with the nephew of Napoleon. Britain and France went to war together with Turkey and invaded Russia. And the Victorians had this concept of the great game. that Russia was the enemy, Russia wanted to destroy England, Russia wanted to invade India, etc., etc. And this was mainly paranoia. And then, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, with Tsar Nicholas II having married the great-granddaughter the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, relations improved, and then there was the alliance of Britain, France and Russia were on the same side in the First World War. However, things were very tense because the British didn't always keep their promises. The Vickers Arms Company didn't supply what they promised to Russia. By the end of 1916, Russia had its own arms industry up and running, and it seems was probably very likely to win the First World War, entering Vienna and Berlin in 1917. And then happened the so-called revolution, which was in fact the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II, planned, orchestrated by Sir George Buchanan, the British ambassador in St. Petersburg, and Anglophile Russian aristocrats. This is the reality. Now, in the Second World War, again, Britain and Russia were allies, but it was an uneasy alliance. Churchill wanted Hitler to invade Russia in June 1941 because then Britain would not be invaded by Germany. And we know what happened in 1945. The Cold War began almost immediately, and we have Churchill's Fulton speech, which said that an Iron Curtain has descended over Europe, and Britain and Russia became enemies. Now in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, things improved. But why did they improve? Was it British love for Russia, the love of the British establishment for Russia? Not particularly. It was because British oil and mineral companies were pulling their products out of Russia for virtually no charge. It was exploitation, it was self-interest. And that all ended, I think, in 2008 with the Munich speech when President Putin stood up and said, enough is enough, every country must defend itself, we have the right. The British establishment, not the people, but the British establishment wants power, it wants wealth. And if Russia stands in the way, Russia becomes the enemy. And we always come back to that infamous statement by Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, in March 1848 in the Houses of Parliament in London, who said that Britain has no friends, no enemies, we only have perpetual interests. In other words, everything is done by self-interest. In other words, there are no principles in the attitudes of the British establishment towards Russia, or anyone else for that matter. There is only self-interest.
Father Andrew, any war is a tragedy. My views were largely, even if not entirely, shaped by Leo Tolstoy's anti-war works, such as Patriotism and Government, and Bethink Yourselves, and the As Long as There Is No War mantra of my grandparents and my grandma particularly. All of them were the great patriotic war veterans, and sadly wars do happen, and the war in my native Donbass began in 2014, not 2022. The supporters of Britain's involvement in the current events often cite the Budapest Memorandum. However, Britain did fail, in my opinion, to act as a peacemaker. And it was Boris Johnson who sabotaged Ukraine's peace talks. According to many sources, Russia was ready to end the war if Ukraine had taken neutrality, as confirmed by Ukraine's own former top negotiator. However, Boris Johnson said, let's just fight. Is this what a peacemaker would say, would propose when a mutually agreeable deal could have been made in spring 2022? How many lives could have been saved on both sides? Can the UK then claim moral high ground after that?
Well, first of all, of course, the war, the conflict in the Ukraine is an absolute tragedy. And it's a double, triple, quadruple tragedy, because in so many ways it's a civil war. Many of the Russian losses have not been Russians, they have been Ukrainians from the east of the Ukraine, Russian speakers, who considered that they were fighting for their liberation from Kiev. So this war has really divided, has split the Ukraine down the middle. So it's in every possible way an absolute tragedy for everybody involved, for both sides. And as people always say when after wars have taken place, well, yes, so-and-so won the war, but now they've got to win the peace. And there is such bitterness among many who previously were friends, relatives, close to each other, and now there's bitterness on both sides. So Britain played the role of the war maker, and it reminds me of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. The blaženstvo. Well, if we turn that on its head, cursed are the war makers, because they shall be called the sons of the devil. And it has to be said that Boris Johnson, ironically with a Russian name Boris, was only too happy. He sabotaged the peace talks, everyone knows this. Having said that, of course, he was only the messenger boy sent from Biden's Washington at the time. So in fairness to him, yes, he did this with enthusiasm, but he was actually sent to do it. And every British Prime Minister since then has been a war maker. We only have to remember the very, very brief Prime Minister, Liz Truss, Prime Minister for just over 40 days, who went to Russia to try and engineer some peace negotiations and said that Russia would have to leave Rostov-on-Don and give it back to the Ukraine. And of course, there was consternation. I mean, how can a British Prime Minister be so ignorant? Or how could she at least not have advisors who would tell her that Rostov-on-Don is in Russia and always has been in Russia? So again, we come up...
And I think she mentioned Voronezh as well, which was even
Yes.
further inside mainland Russia.
Yes, absolutely, even further from the border with the Ukraine. So crass ignorance, but why are people ignorant in positions of power? They can only be ignorant in positions of power either because they want to be ignorant or else because they have some sort of sinister plan, some sinister scheme. And I think that Truss probably knew where these places were, but she was speaking to the Western public and to give the Western public, and especially the UK public, the impression that parts of Russia should be ceded to the Ukraine. It's an extraordinary situation. And I come back to what I said earlier, that the British establishment, the elite, wants to conquer. It wants power. It's never forgiven countries like India for breaking up the empire. It's never forgiven France and Germany for kicking Britain out of the European Union. So here was a chance to get some power, some prestige, to play a role on the international stage. Principles? No such thing exists. I go back to Palmerston's saying that we only have interests. It's completely amoral. So if you're talking about the moral high ground, Britain, the British establishment, has never had the moral high ground, not in the nearly 1,000 years of its history. And you can go through British history and every time it's been the same story. If I may add something personal, my father was in the British Army during the Second World War, and he was fighting in Egypt, and also he took Italian prisoners of war to South Africa. And he, who had never been out of his native village before, recruited into the army because he had to go, he was absolutely disgusted by the way he saw the British elite treating Egyptians and the way in South Africa they treated black people. Now, he was an ordinary Englishman, called to fight to protect his country. He just obeyed, he did what he was told. But when he saw what had been going on behind the backs of the people who live in these islands, in their name, he was disgusted. And this, of course, has become something of a slogan among many British people nowadays, not in my name. People have begun to understand that things are being done by the establishment, elite, and they are disgusted by it. And we saw this very clearly with the Iraq War.
Yes, I mean, as much as we are suspicious towards certain elites, let's say British elite, or rather military-industrial complex, not just in Britain, but we at the same time always felt empathy towards ordinary British people, induced largely by literature, by us being literary inclined, by always admiring, I don't know, the Robin Hood spirit, so to speak, that something that we would sort of relate to, you know, this kind of British people's search for justice, for a just, better world, for fairness. But coming back to ordinary people and the media, the way British media influences them. You know, interestingly, in 2023, we produced a feature, a little featurette titled, "Do the English Want a War?" ? It was a vox pop in London, kind of downplayed and underrated later by YouTube algorithms or whatever else. In that featurette, we asked our respondents, mostly natives, a few questions about a potential conflict, hypothetical conflict between England and Scotland. Why? Because Scotland to England is what Ukraine has always been to Russia. So I thought it would be a fair comparison. So the questions were, if Scotland were to become independent, would it be imperative for it to either remain with the UK in NATO or remain completely neutral? Should stay neutral was the overwhelming response. If any government of an independent Scotland aligned itself with, for instance, Russia or China, would you approve of a potential UK covert operation in Scotland to prevent that? That was the second question. And you know what? The overwhelming majority of responses were yes, absolutely, yes to a potential operation to preclude Scotland from sort of falling into Russia's or China's hands, so to speak. So therefore was the third question. In that case, Russia had the right to launch its own special operation in Ukraine, since the Ukraine fell under America's influence and was on the path of joining NATO. So suddenly the responses changed abruptly to, oh no. So those were representatives not of the establishment, but rather ordinary people, some of them clearly good people, people who smiled, who looked very decent, and just like us. So why there are these double standards with Russia?
Well, there is an old proverb which says, blood is thicker than water, or in Russian, "Своя рубашка ближе к телу." And the Ukraine is a long way away. Most British people, because we live on an island, they have a sense, yes, over there there's France, yes, and there's a bit further there's something else, and Germany is further. After Germany, not quite sure what happens. So there is this kind of provincialism, this localism, and people would never make the connection between Russia and the Ukraine and England and Scotland, which seems very strange because the patron saint of Scotland is St. Andrew. St. Andrew is much venerated in the Ukraine. I've always felt, for example, that Belarus corresponds to Wales, Scotland to the Ukraine, and Ireland, of course, would correspond to Poland from a Russian perspective. I think quite simply it's, again, this mixture of ignorance which comes from insularity, living on an island, and it's certain indifference. Yes, Scotland is next door. We have to be careful there. The Ukraine, Russia, people have no idea.
2003, remind me if I'm wrong with the date, there were once massive anti-war protests in London against the war in Iraq. Why-
2003.
Yeah, 2003. Why then were there no protests near Ukrainian embassy in 2014, 2015 and 2016 when the Ukrainian army waged a war in Donbass, or when Ukraine's president signed a constitutional amendment on NATO's membership? Wasn't it evident that it would provoke Russia, it would lead to a major conflict similar to what would occur if, for example, Scotland exited the UK and sought to join a military alliance with Russia or China? But did we Russians make any mistake? Did we fail to explain people to people, say Russian people to British people, not government to government, what was going on in Donbass? Did we fail to explain our case against Ukraine joining NATO? These are not rhetorical questions. This is kind of what we call in Russian a разбор полетов, self-debriefing, if you like.
Well, as regards the biggest demonstration in British history, which was the anti-war demonstration against the Blair regime in 2003, over 1 million people, or perhaps 2 million, I can't remember, demonstrated against the war. Why did this take place? Well, quite simply because Britain was concerned with Iraq, because British troops were going to go there and get killed. And of course, British money was going to be spent there. And yet Iraq has absolutely no connection, presents absolutely no threat, and never did present any threat to this country. So people were directly concerned. On the other hand, there is a problem with Russian PR. I remember in Moscow in 2012, I was speaking to one of the bishops about PR, надо пиарить. And I understood that the word PR in Russian is a dirty word because it's connected with the communist regime. PR for Russian means lies. It's propaganda. Whereas in the West, PR is about presenting things, and not necessarily in a false way, not necessarily lying, but presenting things as they are. And I've got to say that Russians are very bad at PR. It's improved in the last 3 years, but in this country, who had heard of the Donbass? Who knew what was going on in the Donbass? Obviously, state-controlled media like the BBC didn't report it, or if they did report it, it was in a completely twisted way. So people just didn't know. I wish that Russia had been able to present things in a better way.
Father Andrew,
Yes.
your book, Orthodox Christianity and the English Tradition, is as unique as it is revolutionary and transformative. I always come back to it to find some comfort in these highly uncomfortable times in the Russo-British relations. And your book challenges every prejudice held by either Russophobes or Anglophobes, including a famous notion that it's the English which befalls and the West's idiosyncrasy about Russians are coming and all that. Is it because for you as an Orthodox priest there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither Anglo-Saxon nor Slav, Russian, for we are all one in Jesus Christ? Or is it because there is something unique about the Russian-British equilibrium? And we are talking people, not the elites here. Russian-British equilibrium, if I may, that everyone overlooked. Or even more so, because the true people's Russia and true people's Britain aren't opposing forces at all, but are something on the contrary.
Well, obviously, as a priest, I have no problem with races. I mean, we have a church here which is multinational with 25 nationalities, and Russians stand alongside Ukrainians, and they stand alongside Moldovans who stand alongside Russians. This is a non-problem. I always say to people who come to this church, leave your passport at the door. Leave your politics at the door. We don't want to know. We're not interested in that. Doesn't mean to say that we're naive or stupid or we don't know what's going on in the world. Yes, we do. but there is no need for any kind of racial friction or tension. Again, I would go back to the Victorian age. The Victorians, that is to say the Victorian elite, invented something called the Great Game. And the Great Game was this hostility to Russia. Russia's going to invade India. Russia's going to do this. Russia's going to do that. And this became paranoia with the Victorians. So yes, there's been a special, well, I won't say relationship, a special hostility between Britain and Russia because we were rivals in the past. And the British establishment today wants to continue that. It is absurd because Britain today is a very minor country, a second-rate country in the world. It has no empire. Russia is a great power, like America, like China, like India. So I think the British elite just has to take a look at reality and realise where it really stands. We're a small country, we're not terribly important. Let's get on with everyone. But the British elite doesn't want to. It's always harking back to the past and its great game which it invented.
Let's forget the elites for a moment. What's important is the people and the spirit on the two sides of this equilibrium. What does make people's England, people's Britain, and people's Russia special in their relationship with each other, where it's mostly hate between the establishments, but it's love and hate, or rather almost love and mutual fascination between the people, isn't it? I mean, we are curious. I mean, we want to know more about that distant, mystical land, little island, small island. And British are also quite fascinated with Russia, with the Russian winter, with bears, with Leo Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Russian beauty, and what have you. I mean, is there anything that kind of makes these two peoples special in their relationship with each other?
I think the positive relationship between the peoples is patterned by the sense of the exotic. For the average person in Britain, Russians are exotic. I mean, you mentioned the snow, the Russian bear, Russian attitudes, and this is not necessarily a bad thing at all. And then, of course, there is the attraction to Russian culture. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. Pushkin, unfortunately, is still relatively little known. Turgenev, then more writers from the Soviet period like Pasternak and Solzhenitsyn. All this is exotic. And I think that from the Russian viewpoint, Britain is very exotic. We still have these incredibly old-fashioned stereotypes. Tumane Albion, the mists of England, and which of course never really existed. It's interesting that you say that you're asking these questions from Moscow where there's no sunshine. Here there's brilliant sunshine and there's definitely no fog or mist. So a figure like Sherlock Holmes, for example, now that is exotic for a Russian. The English sense of rationalism, the English sense of observation, the English way of reasoning, this is very attractive to Russians, to others as well. So I think it's the sense of the exotic. We are very different. And it's a bit like a man and a woman. They fall in love. Well, a man is a man, a woman is a woman. They're different, they're exotic. And if you want, there's a little bit of the attraction of opposites.
Yes, well, I don't know if you read Alexei Khomyakov, who was both a passionate Russophile Pochvenik and a man of inner Russia. And,
I knew his great-grandson.
Yes, an Anglophile at the same time. And in his letter about England in 1848, if I'm not wrong, he wrote an ode to both Russia and Britain, where he found so many similarities that actually his statement was very bold, that there are no two countries on earth and in Europe which would be as similar in some core spiritual things as England and Russia. I don't know if you read that essay.
Yes, a long time ago, but I read it, yes.
What do you think about it? How much of it is still alive?
I think the potential is very much there. Khomyakov saw the potential for it, and he felt it, and he knew it, and of course his English was wonderful, and he really entered into the spirit of England. And here I have to make a distinction, not Britain, but England. For example, I never considered myself to be British. I am English. I was born in England. Unfortunately, I have a British passport. I'd much rather have an English passport. I think England and Russia have a great deal in common. But Britain is a word which I don't recognise and I dislike, because immediately the British establishment. But what Alexei Khomyakov found in common, it's still there, it's still potentially there. I mean, only a few weeks ago I went to see Lebedine Ozero, the ballet by Tchaikovsky, Swan Lake, full of English people, and they enjoyed it, wonderful. These cultural connections are still alive today, and they can be revived more and more. And I think that this, after the events in the Ukraine are over, I think this is the way we'll go. We'll see Russian opera companies, ballet companies, exhibitions of art, of literature, starting again. And this old liking for one another can start again. And similarly, in this country, if we similarly tour Russia, I know, for example, that President Putin loves the bagpipes. And one of his dreams is for a Scottish regiment to play the bagpipes on Red Square. Why not? I think these things become possible once this dreadful establishment has gone. And you know, things look pretty grim at the moment, but things are changing very rapidly in the Trumpian world. I think Trump and his allies like Musk, they want to operate regime changes in Germany, in France, and in the UK. And I think we're going to see regime changes. You may say that that's very dramatic, but after all, there was a regime change in the USA. In the USA, there was a president called Biden, and the Democratic Party, to which he belonged, replaced him with a woman called Harris. It was a regime change from inside. And, you know, there's an old saying in British politics, here today, gone tomorrow. All of this passes away. And, of course, we can be optimistic. We can also be pessimistic. We don't know how it's going to work out, how it's going to go, how long it's going to take. But I remain cautiously optimistic about the longer-term future.
I suppose that I would like to find out about your sort of, political stance, if you like. You concluded your latest article with the words, "One day we, English, Irish, Scots and Welsh, will rise up and put an end to the 1,000-year-old tyranny of the British establishment." So what is, in the ideal world, your preferred form of government for the countries that make up the United Kingdom? The English People's Republic, the Scottish People's Republic, as well as, Irish and Welsh republics, united or autonomous, and does monarchy still fit in that scenario?
I think if we want to dream, then I think that the English, the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish should get along. And I think we should form some sort of a confederation. If one part of those four peoples who live in these islands, if one part of those peoples wish to have a monarchy, why not? The obvious case would be the English, but I think the English should have an English monarchy because for nearly 1,000 years we've had French Welsh, Scottish, Dutch and German. We now have a German monarchy. It's been diluted somewhat with English blood, but they all have the Habsburg jaw. They are all Germans. As you know, in 1917, I think it was 1917, the British monarchy of the time changed their surname to Windsor, originally Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. They spoke with German accents. In the 18th century, there were German monarchs who didn't even speak English, the Hanoverians, the George I, and so on. Let's have an English monarchy. Let's have a king or queen of the people. But we're a long, long way from that. I think at the moment, what we're going to see and what we have to see is the long-awaited fall of the establishment and some kind of popular government, a government of the people, for the people. It's very sad that in this country we have no constitution. The Americans, whatever you may say, they have a constitution, and their constitution begins, "We the people." Well, we don't have that. It's we the establishment against you the people. And there is this huge gulf between establishment and people, and it's always been there. This is not the case in today's Russia. President Putin has popularity ratings of between 60 and 90%. Russians will complain about certain aspects. He's no saint and so on, which I understand. But in this country, find a government that gets any more than 30% of popularity, it's really quite difficult. The President Starmer government, for example, was voted in by 20% of the electorate. And there's this huge gulf, and not only in Britain, especially in Britain, but elsewhere in Western Europe, between the governing elite, the ruling class, and the people. And I don't think that Russians understand that. And it's an important point.
Well, if we will move away from politics and into the realm of orthodoxy and people, we in the Russian Hour have a very diverse audience comprising Russians and Russian speakers from all over the place who speak English, or those who don't and learn it, British people who are interested in Russia but who have never been to an Orthodox church, and last but not least, now people in the Middle East who have a very limited knowledge of Russia or Orthodoxy, apart from those who traveled here. Can you please pray for them? Pray for these people, as well as for People's England, as well as People's Scotland and other parts of the UK, and People's Russia, including, of course, the People's Donbass and People's Crimea, and for People's Ukraine too.
Господи, помоги нам и дай нам мир, взаимопонимание и любовь друг к другу, всем нашим народам.